When my stepbrother said, "We split the $50 million estate," I believed him. I believed him because I needed to believe someone. I was a widow with 3 kids, Micah, 7, Jonah, 5, and my baby girl, Nova, 2, standing in a quiet lawyer's office where grief was thicker than the smell of leather and paper. He squeezed my shoulder like we were a team. "Nola, you can rest. I'll take care of everything." That night, I wrote a list on the back of a grocery receipt: rent, childcare, tuition, food, diapers. Grief does not stop grocery lists. The next morning, I packed snacks for school and told the boys to be kind to their teachers. I kissed Nova's curls and inhaled the vanilla lotion I'd rubbed into her cheeks. I told myself everything would be okay. Days passed. Then weeks. He kept saying, "Paperwork takes time." Then it was, "The lawyers are slow." Then, "Buyers need to verify titles." I still slept with my phone under the pillow, half expecting my husband to call and say this was all a terrible mistake. Death didn't give me that kindness. One afternoon, my stepbrother sent a message. "I've liquidated 2 properties to stabilize taxes. I'll send your portion soon." I typed back, "Which 2?" He replied, "Harborfront and Westridge." Those were the crown jewels. I felt my chest go cold. I called. He didn't answer. He texted, "Busy with buyers. Trust me." A week later, I learned the truth in the most humiliating way possible. Not from the lawyers, not from him, but from a real estate blog. The entire portfolio had been sold to shell companies for below market prices. The writer called it a puzzling fire sale. I called and called until my throat hurt. Nothing. Then an unknown number rang. "Stop calling," he said, voice flat. "Tell anyone, and I can't guarantee your kid's safety." My world went silent. I locked the door. I pushed the couch against it like that thin wood could stop fear. I closed the curtains and watched sunlight turn my living room into stripes across toys and laundry baskets, and I realized I was in a different kind of darkness now. Not grief, not poverty. A cage. I moved us to a friend's spare room for a week. Then a church basement. Then a tiny sublet under a couple who argued at midnight. I picked up 3 jobs. Nights stocking shelves, weekends cleaning offices, and early mornings delivering breakfast sandwiches. I learned how to boil a bag of rice and stretch it into 2 meals. I learned how to cry quietly so I wouldn't wake the children. But I also learned something else. I learned that silence is exactly what men like him count on. So I did the scariest thing I could do, with no money, no backup, and 3 small hands clinging to me. I started writing everything down. Every message, every lie, every transfer I could trace, and I promised my children that one day we would walk back into our home through the front door. Not as victims, as owners. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. The day my father's will was read, the air in the attorney's office felt heavier than any funeral I'd ever attended. Mahogany shelves lined the walls, stuffed with law books I couldn't read, and family portraits that weren't mine. I sat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, Micah's crayon drawing sticking out of my purse, a reminder that while the rest of the world saw millions, I still saw lunchboxes, rent, and bedtime stories. Beside me, my stepbrother Alaron leaned back like a king waiting for his crown. He had the easy charm of someone who'd never worried about bills, and a smile too polished to trust. When the lawyer finally spoke, the room held its breath. Mr. Harrison's estate, estimated at $50 million, is to be split equally between his child, Nola Harrison, and his stepson, Alaron Harrison. Alaron had taken Dad's last name years ago, though he was never legally adopted. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in months. 50 million? Even half of that could secure my children's future, Micah, Jonah, and little Nova, and give us a home without fear. Alaron reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "We're family. We'll do this together," he said, eyes gleaming. I believed him. Over the next weeks, I let him handle the details while I focused on keeping my children's world stable. He reassured me that the paperwork was in motion, that buyers were interested, that everything was under control. And when he smiled and said, "You can rest now," I did. I had no idea that was the last peaceful night I'd have for years, and that the man calling me sister was about to strip me of everything my father left behind. 2 months passed without a single transfer. At first, I brushed it off. Legal processes take time, I told myself. Probate, valuations, signatures. Those were words I had heard in passing, though I barely understood them. Timeline will read in March. Paperwork stretched to June. First suspicious transfers hit in July. Restitution later totaled 46 Maulers ordered. 9 Maulers recovered within months, with the remainder scheduled through asset liquidation. But something about Aleron's updates started to feel off. "Just a few more weeks," he'd say, brushing away my questions with a casual wave of his hand. "I'm consolidating the properties. You'll get your share once the paperwork clears." Meanwhile, my savings were vanishing. I'd used what little I had to cover Micah's school fees, Jonah's medical bills, and diapers for Nova. Every night, I sat at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, staring at numbers that refused to stretch. I asked to see the documents, the estate accounts, the titles, anything. Aleron laughed like I'd made a silly joke. "Nola, you don't need to stress. Dad trusted me to manage this. And so should you." Something in his tone, that thin layer of condescension, made my stomach twist. I started noticing smaller signs, too. A sudden upgrade to his car, weekend trips for business, and a social media post from a luxury auction house showcasing a rare Harrison Estate antique collection, the same one Dad had promised to leave for my children. Still, I wanted to believe him. I needed to, because the alternative, that my only remaining family was betraying me, was too heavy to carry. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I sent him a polite but firm message. "Aleron, I need clarity on the estate. It's been 2 months. Can we meet?" His reply came minutes later. "Relax, Nola. Everything's under control." But for the first time, I didn't believe him. The 3rd month brought with it a tension I could no longer ignore. The few more weeks line had stretched into an entire season, and my patience, already thin from sleepless nights and double shifts, was fraying. The bills were piling up, and the savings my husband left us were nearly gone. "Aleron," I said one afternoon over the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need a timeline. Rent's due. The kids need new shoes. I can't keep waiting without knowing what's going on." There was a pause. Too long. Then he chuckled softly. "You worry too much, Nola. These deals take time. I'm in talks with buyers who can make us more than we ever imagined." But something about his tone felt different, distant, distracted. And when he said us, it sounded less like we and more like me. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I did something I hadn't done before. I Googled my father's estate properties. My heart stopped. Several listings had disappeared, sold, but not to any company I recognized. The names were foreign, tucked away under corporate shells with no public owners. The next day, I confronted him again. "Did you sell something without telling me?" "Of course not," he said too quickly. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. And he knew it. Later that evening, I received a text from a mutual acquaintance, someone who worked at a luxury real estate firm. "Congrats on the big deals. Aleron's been quite the seller lately. It felt like the floor beneath me was giving way. The man who promised we'd split everything was already spending what wasn't his. And if I didn't act soon, there might be nothing left to split at all." 2 days later, I decided I couldn't rely on whispers and half-truths anymore. I needed evidence. I dressed the kids, dropped Micah and Jonah off at school, and left Nova with my neighbor, Mrs. Torres, while I went to the county records office. My hands were trembling as I typed my father's name into the property search system. What came up made my knees go weak. Every major property from the estate, The Lakeview townhouse, the coastal vineyard, the downtown commercial lot, including Harborfront and Westridge, had been transferred to a company I'd never heard of, Hendricks Capital LLC. And the kicker? Alaron was listed as the sole authorized agent. The date of sale? 2 weeks ago. The sale price? A fraction of the market value. I stumbled out of the records room, heart pounding. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was theft. That evening, I confronted him at his office. He didn't even look surprised to see me. "You've been digging?" he said, leaning back in his leather chair, smirking. "You sold everything," I hissed. "Behind my back. Without my consent," he shrugged. "You signed the authorization." My stomach flipped. "What authorization?" He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a document bearing my name and signature, except it wasn't mine. The signature was a forgery. I felt the blood drain from my face. "This is illegal," he leaned forward, voice low and venomous. "Then go ahead. Report me, but remember, accidents happen. And you have 3 little ones who can't afford accidents." The room spun. It was no longer about money. He was threatening my children. And in that moment, I knew I was in deeper danger than I'd ever imagined. I left Alaron's office that evening, shaking so badly I had to sit in my car before I could even drive. The forged signature burned into my mind, bold, confident, and terrifyingly perfect. It wasn't a sloppy imitation. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing, but it was his threat that truly shattered me. Accidents happen. Those 2 words looped in my head over and over like a curse. I couldn't stop imagining the worst. Micah stepping into the street without looking, Jonah vanishing from the schoolyard, Nova's crib empty in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep. I pushed the couch against the door and sat awake, clutching a kitchen knife like it could ward off everything. Every creak of the house felt like someone breaking in. Every car passing by sounded like it had stopped outside for us. I called the police the next morning, but the officer's tone was weary and unconcerned. "Did he explicitly threaten harm?" he asked. "He said accidents happen," I whispered. "That's not a direct threat. Without evidence, there's not much we can do." I hung up, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. Alaron had taken my father's fortune, my security, my dignity, and now he was taking my peace. So I made a decision. I withdrew the little money I had left, sold the last jewelry my husband had given me, and disappeared with the kids. We bounced between spare rooms, shelters, and borrowed spaces. It wasn't living, it was surviving, but survival was still something. And in those long, sleepless nights, I began to understand. Silence was my enemy. Evidence was my weapon. And one day, I would make him regret ever underestimating me. Leaving our home felt like tearing out a piece of my soul. Every memory, the height marks on the wall, the swing in the backyard, the smell of my husband's cologne still clinging to the closet. I left it all behind for one reason, to keep my children alive. We moved quietly and without a trace. First, we stayed with Sabrina, my oldest friend, in her small apartment across town. "You can stay as long as you need," she promised. But after a week, the strain showed. 4 people in one room was too much. Next came a church shelter, then a tiny room above a laundromat with a lock that barely turned. I learned to live in constant vigilance. I never took the same route twice. I picked the boys up from school early and carried Nova close against my chest. And every night I checked the windows twice before I dared to close my eyes. Money was gone almost instantly. My last savings disappeared into food, bus fare, and secondhand clothes for the kids. I swallowed my pride and took whatever work I could find, cleaning houses during the day, stocking shelves at night. One evening, while scrubbing tiles in an office building, I overheard 2 janitors talking about a property Alaron had sold. "Guy made a killing," one of them said. "Moved the money offshore." Smart man, offshore. That word stuck with me. I didn't even know what it meant legally, but I knew enough to understand. He wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding everything. And that's when the fear inside me started turning into something sharper, something harder, something like resolve. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to fight back, even if I had to start with nothing. It started with a spiral notebook, the cheapest kind I could find at the dollar store. I opened it one night after the kids had fallen asleep, flipped to the first page, and wrote in shaky letters, everything Alaron did. At first, it was just fragments, dates, places, snippets of conversations I remembered. But soon it became an obsession. I dug through every old email, every text message, every voicemail he'd ever sent. I listed every property my father had owned, every asset mentioned in the will, and cross-referenced them with public records. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Property after property had been sold to shell companies with no real owners, but I noticed the same two names over and over, Hendricks Capital and Marlowe Consulting. The signatures were forged, the sale prices suspiciously low, and the transfers rapid, but it was a bank transaction that chilled me to the bone. While cleaning a friend's office, I sneaked a glance at a news site reporting on foreign investments. Buried in the article was a familiar name, A. Harrison, linked to a multi-million-dollar transfer to a bank in the Cayman Islands. I sat back, heart hammering. Alaron hadn't just betrayed me. He was laundering the money. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed someone who understood what I was seeing, someone who could help me turn my scattered notes into a weapon. That's when I thought of Ayo, a forensic accountant I'd met at church years ago. He once told me, paper trails don't lie. People do. My aunt lost her house to a forged quitclaim, he said. I don't let that happen to other families. I stared at my notebook, then at the 3 sleeping children beside me. It was time to stop hiding. It was time to start building a case. I hadn't spoken to Ayo in nearly 3 years, not since my husband's funeral. Back then, he was just a kind face in the crowd. A quiet man with sharp eyes who helped families understand legal documents they barely understood. But now, he was the only person I could think of who might believe me. It took me 2 days to gather the courage to call. When I finally did, my voice shook. Ayo! It's Nola. I need help. He didn't hesitate. Tell me everything. I told him about the forged signatures, the threats, the offshore accounts, everything I'd pieced together from scraps of evidence and sleepless nights. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he spoke again. You're not paranoid, he said finally. This isn't sloppy theft. It's a calculated scheme. And if what you're saying is true, there's a paper trail we can trace. Hope, faint and fragile, bloomed in my chest for the first time in months. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town. I handed him my spiral notebook, pages worn from constant flipping. He flipped through it silently, nodding to himself. This is good, he murmured. Messy, but good. If we can verify even half of this, we can build a case strong enough to take to court. But Alaron's threatening me, I whispered. He said if I talk, he met my eyes, steady and unflinching. That's exactly why you have to talk. Men like him rely on fear. Once you shine a light on their lies, they start to unravel. And for the first time, I believed it. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't powerless after all. Just as that flicker of hope began to grow, Alaron found a way to crush it. 2 nights after meeting Ayo, I came home from my part-time cleaning job to find my front door ajar. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed it open, praying my children were still asleep upstairs. The living room was untouched, too untouched. The picture frames I'd left scattered on the coffee table were neatly aligned. The folded laundry I hadn't finished was gone. Then I saw it, a single white envelope taped to the refrigerator door. You talk, they disappear. No signature. No explanation. Just those 6 words. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the world spinning around me. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew Alaron's reach. He had money, lawyers, and friends in places I didn't, and worse, he had my children's names. I barely slept that night. I sat in the hallway outside Micah, Jonah, and Nova's room, listening to their soft breaths, promising myself I'd never let anyone hurt them. But fear was a poison. and Alaron had planted it deep. The next morning, I met Ayo again, the note trembling in my hands. "He knows," I whispered. "He's watching us." He read the message, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about money anymore. He's escalating, and that means he's scared. Scared." I laughed bitterly. "I'm terrified." "Exactly. That means he's losing control," Ayo said firmly. "And people like Alaron get desperate when they're cornered. We need to move carefully, but we're not stopping." It was then I realized I wasn't just fighting for my father's fortune anymore. I was fighting for my children's future and their very lives. The next few days were a blur of tension, fear, and sleepless nights. I started noticing cars parked too long across the street. A shadow seemed to follow me when I walked the kids to school. Ayo insisted it was Alaron trying to intimidate me into silence, and it was working. My stomach churned constantly, my hands shook when I signed my name, and every creak of the floorboards felt like the start of something terrible. But I couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Ayo brought me a plan. We file a preliminary complaint, not a full lawsuit yet. This will let us subpoena financial records before Alaron knows how deep we're digging. And if he's moving the money, we'll catch him in the act. I hesitated. "And if he finds out?" "He will," Ayo admitted. "But by then we'll already have enough evidence that he can't erase it all." It was a terrifying gamble, but it was the only one we had. The hardest part was keeping it all secret from the children. Micah asked why I looked so tired. Jonas started sleeping in my bed because he was having nightmares about bad men taking him away. Little Nova clung to me constantly, sensing that something was wrong, even if she didn't understand what. Then, one evening, the phone rang. A distorted voice hissed on the other end. "You think you're clever? You think you can beat us? You'll regret this." Click. I sat in silence long after the call ended, heart pounding. Alaron was getting desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. I tucked the kids into bed, kissed their foreheads, and whispered a promise into the dark. "No matter what it takes, I will win this. I will protect you." The war for my family's future had officially begun. The day I brought Ayo into the fight was the day the tide began to shift. Until then, I'd been stumbling through a minefield, scared, exhausted, and trying to fight a multi-million-dollar fraud with screenshots and half-baked Google searches. But Ayo? He was a storm in a suit, a forensic accountant who'd helped families recover stolen inheritances before, and a man whose faith in justice was stronger than my fear. We met in the back pew after Sunday service, the children playing by the altar while the choir rehearsed. I slid a manila folder across the bench. Bank statements, property transfer logs, screenshots of shell companies. Ayo flipped through them, his expression tightening with every page. "This isn't amateur work," he murmured. "It's a sophisticated laundering web. But you're lucky. These people always leave fingerprints." Within hours, he'd set up a burner email linked to an encrypted inbox where whistleblowers could safely share tips. He also created a dead drop system, a physical mailbox at a nearby co-op, to collect any anonymous documents from frightened insiders. We were going to build a paper trail brick by brick, even if Alaron had erased every official record. "Step 1, Ayo said, eyes sharp. "We file for an emergency injunction. If the court grants it, we can freeze any remaining assets before he drains them." I felt the smallest flicker of power return to me. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting, I was striking back. As I walked home that evening, holding Nova's tiny hand, I whispered a promise under my breath. "You took everything from me once, Alaron. This time I'm coming for it all, and I'm not stopping." The hunt had officially begun. Ayo worked like a man possessed. Within 48 hours, he had drafted a detailed emergency injunction and filed it with the court. The document was a masterstroke, a meticulous breakdown of property transfers, suspicious bank movements, and forged sale authorizations, all tied back to Alaron's schemes. Every piece of evidence we'd collected painted a picture of deliberate fraud and theft. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in the only suit I still owned. a faded navy blazer I'd worn to my husband's funeral. My hands shook as I fastened the buttons. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about survival, for me and my 3 children. When the judge entered the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Alaron's lawyer showed up, but Alaron himself was nowhere to be found. "Your Honor," the attorney said, oozing false confidence, "my client maintains that all transactions were legal and consensual. My client and Ms. Harrison agreed to sell the assets jointly." "Then where is the notarized consent?" Ayo cut in sharply. "Because we have nothing but forged signatures and evidence of offshore accounts." He laid down a thick binder of documents that landed with a heavy thud on the bench. The judge leafed through the papers, his brow furrowing. "I'm granting a partial freeze of all known accounts tied to the estate," he said finally. "I also order a full forensic audit within 30 days. If the defendant refuses to comply, we'll proceed to contempt charges." It wasn't total victory, but it was the first crack in Alaron's armor. As we left the courthouse, Ayo put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "This is how empires fall," he said quietly. "Not with explosions, but with small, deliberate strikes." For the first time, I felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not mine. The injunction had shaken Alaron's confidence, but I knew he was far from finished. Men like him didn't surrender, they schemed harder. And so I had to move faster. The next step was one Ayo had called social pressure. If we could expose the pattern of his secret property sales publicly, regulators and other victims might come forward, multiplying the pressure he was already under. I contacted an investigative reporter under the pseudonym E.M. Hart, a nod to my late husband's initials. We met in a corner booth of a quiet cafe, my heart pounding as I slid a flash drive across the table. It contained months of notes, screenshots, corporate filings, proof of forged authorizations, and the list of shell companies Alaron had used to offload our father's properties. "This could blow up," the reporter warned. "Are you prepared for the consequences?" "More than you know," I said, my voice steady. "He's destroyed my children's future. I'm not letting him ruin anyone else's." For months I'd been reacting. That morning the court froze his accounts. By evening the headline had a name and a face. Power shifted. He was suddenly answering to us. A week later, the story hit the front page. Multi-million-dollar inheritance swindle. Heirs claim stepbrother sold $50 estate in secret. It was everywhere. Morning talk shows, financial blogs, even local radio. Alaron's name was now synonymous with betrayal and fraud. Whispers began swirling through the city's business circles. Investors pulled out of ventures he was involved in. His so-called friends stopped returning calls. Even his lawyer filed a motion to withdraw from the case. But the most satisfying part? A trickle of new emails arriving in the burner inbox. People claiming they too had been scammed by Alaron in other deals. It wasn't just me anymore. That first piece ran with my identity shielded. The deeper, on-record exposé would come later. The empire he'd built on deceit was starting to crumble. And this time, the whole world was watching. Just when I thought momentum was on my side, Alaron struck back, and the blow nearly knocked the wind out of me. 2 weeks after the article went viral, a thick envelope arrived at my attorney's office. Inside were documents, dozens of them, stamped, sealed, and signed by me. Each one authorized property sales, asset transfers, and bank withdrawals. My heart stopped when I saw my name written at the bottom of every page. "That's not my signature," I whispered, my voice trembling. "They're claiming it is," my lawyer replied grimly. "And if the court believes it, it could undo the injunction. Worse, it could make you look like a co-conspirator." I felt sick. Alaron had anticipated my every move. He'd prepared fake consent forms long before the sales had even happened. It wasn't just betrayal. It was entrapment. Ayo examined the documents closely, running his fingers over the ink lines. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a small inconsistency. "See the looping here? It's copied from a check you signed years ago. He must have scanned and forged it digitally. We immediately filed a motion to challenge the documents and requested a handwriting analysis. It would take weeks I didn't have, but it was the only way to prove my innocence. As if that weren't enough, Alaron's lawyer filed a defamation suit against me, claiming I had orchestrated a smear campaign with the press. It was a textbook intimidation tactic, but it still sent chills down my spine. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. Alaron was trying to erase the truth itself and bury me along with it. But I wasn't the terrified widow he'd once bullied into silence. Now I was armed, furious, and ready for war. The forged documents were just the beginning. A week later, the war escalated into something far more personal and far more terrifying. It started as a normal afternoon. I was walking my middle child, Jonah, home from preschool while my eldest, Micah, waited at a friend's house. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I expected another legal update, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a photo. My children, walking out of school, beneath it, a message. Drop the case. Or next time, they won't come home. I stopped breathing. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the phone. I scanned the street. Every passing car suddenly suspicious. Every face a potential threat. I called Ayo immediately. "He's threatening my kids," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He knows where they are. Listen to me," Ayo said firmly. "Document everything. Save that message. And move now. We'll contact the police, but you need to get somewhere safe tonight." That night, we packed only what we could carry and fled to a women's shelter in another district. I didn't tell anyone, not even Sabrina, where we were going. The shelter's address was confidential, and the police assigned a liaison to our case. They couldn't prove the message was from Alaron, but we all knew it was. I filed for a restraining order and reported the threat, adding yet another layer to the growing legal firestorm. But in my heart, I knew this wasn't just a scare tactic. Alaron was desperate. Cornered animals always lash out. Lying awake on a thin mattress with my children huddled beside me, I swore silently into the dark. "You came after my babies. That was your final mistake." The fear was gone now, replaced by something far more dangerous. Resolve. The blackmail attempt made one thing painfully clear. Alaron was losing control. And when powerful people feel that grip slipping, they make mistakes. That's exactly what Ayo and I were counting on. "Money leaves footprints," Ayo told me as we huddled in a quiet co-working space late one night. He'd been combing through transaction logs, offshore filings, and leaks from international financial databases. "And your stepbrother just left a very big one." The breakthrough came from a transfer routed through a trust named after my late husband, Elijah. A trust that shouldn't have existed anymore. Tracing it led us to a small private bank on a Caribbean island, notorious for laundering stolen inheritance money. And there it was, over $28 million parked in 3 accounts, each under shell companies linked to Alaron and his fixer, Cliff Marlowe. But that wasn't the shocking part. Another $12 million had been funneled into a holding company in Lisbon, the same city where Alaron was reportedly hiding. The paper trail was undeniable now. He wasn't just selling properties. He was laundering the profits globally, preparing to disappear completely. Once we can prove these accounts are tied to stolen assets, we can bring in the Financial Crimes Unit, Ayo explained. If they cooperate internationally, those accounts will freeze before he can move the money again. For the first time, I felt like I was standing on higher ground. Alaron had thought he could vanish with the family fortune, but his arrogance had betrayed him. Every hidden dollar was now a breadcrumb leading us straight to him. I closed my eyes and exhaled, whispering a promise I intended to keep. "You can run to the ends of the earth, Alaron. But I'm coming for every cent, and I won't stop until you're in handcuffs." By the time we traced Alaron's money trail offshore, I knew we needed more than legal filings. We needed sunlight. Corruption like his thrived in darkness, and if I wanted regulators and law enforcement to care, I had to drag his crimes into the public eye. I met investigative journalist Danica Chambers in a quiet cafe downtown. She was known for exposing white-collar fraud and for never backing down from a story, no matter how powerful the target. I slid a flash drive across the table. Shell companies, fake trusts, offshore accounts. Everything traces back to Aileron Harrison, I whispered. My stepbrother. Danica's eyes widened as she scrolled through the documents. This isn't just theft, she murmured. This is organized fraud. He's laundering tens of millions and using your father's estate to do it. She promised to run the story, but she needed more than just spreadsheets and screenshots. Can you go on record? She asked. It was a terrifying thought. If I revealed my identity, Aileron could retaliate. Legally, socially, maybe even physically. But if I didn't, the story might never get the traction we needed. I stared out the cafe window, thinking of my children sleeping on a friend's floor, of the nights I cried over unpaid bills, of my father's legacy vanishing into tax havens. Yes, I said finally. Tell the world. A week later, the headline exploded across financial news sites. Family fortune stolen, widow accuses stepbrother of $50 million offshore laundering scheme. The fallout was immediate. Regulators launched preliminary investigations. Former investors began contacting authorities. Aileron's carefully curated image as a savvy businessman started to unravel. For the first time, he was on the run, not just from me, but from the truth. And the world was watching. The news article detonated like a bomb. Within days, whispers turned into lawsuits, and Aileron's spotless reputation was in shreds. But the most surprising reaction didn't come from the public. It came from inside our family. One evening, as I tucked the kids into bed in our small temporary apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. We need to talk. I know what Aileron did. It was from Elaine, our cousin, someone who had always stayed neutral, too polite to pick sides. We met in a quiet park the next day. Elaine looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. I've been keeping something, she whispered, pulling a small USB drive from her purse. Aileron trusted me too much. He forwarded me some messages by mistake. I couldn't look at you or the kids after reading them. On the drive were dozens of emails and text screenshots, all between Aileron and Cliff Marlowe. They weren't just talking about selling off the estate. They were bragging about it. One message read, "She's too weak to fight. By the time she figures it out, we'll have moved everything offshore." Another was worse. If she talks, scare her. Remind her she has 3 kids. I felt a surge of rage and nausea. These weren't just financial crimes. They were calculated acts of cruelty. Elaine reached over, touching my hand gently. I was scared. He threatened me too. But after what he did to you, I couldn't stay silent. The new evidence was a gift, proof of premeditation and intimidation. It was exactly what our case needed to shift from civil litigation to criminal prosecution. And just like that, Aileron's wall of silence had its first crack, and it was coming from his own family. The article and Elaine's evidence had blown the case wide open, but victory was still far from certain. The moment Aileron sensed he was losing control, the fight took a darker turn. It started with an unknown number calling me just after midnight. At first I ignored it, but when the 5th call came in, and a distorted voice hissed, "Drop the case or you'll never see your kids again," my heart stopped cold. I reported the threat to the police immediately, but they said without proof their hands were tied. I doubled down on security, changed school routes, notified staff, even had my friend Sabrina pick the kids up without warning. 2 days later, my worst fear nearly came true. A black van tried to block my eldest son Micah's school bus on a quiet street corner. The driver panicked and veered off before they could make contact, but the children were terrified, and I knew it was no coincidence. Someone had sent a message. As if that wasn't enough, the pressure campaign escalated in other ways. My attorney, the one who had been handling the injunction and civil lawsuit, suddenly withdrew from the case. "It's too dangerous for my firm," he said curtly over the phone. "They know where my kids go to school." I couldn't blame him, but I felt more alone than ever. It was clear Alaron had resources, people willing to intimidate, stalk, and even attempt abductions. He was trying to scare me into silence, but he didn't realize something important. Every threat only hardened my resolve. He had already taken my inheritance, my home, my security. I wasn't about to let him take my children, or my dignity too. This was no longer just about money. It was about survival. The attempted kidnapping changed everything. Until that moment, this battle had been about justice, about reclaiming what Alaron had stolen and exposing the truth. But now it was war, and I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for my children's safety and our future. I moved us again, this time to a small rental house 2 towns over. The kids thought we were on an extended vacation. I didn't tell them about the van, or the late-night phone calls, or the strange man I caught taking pictures of our building one morning. They were already frightened enough. At night, after they fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the mounting legal documents. Without a lawyer, I was adrift. Alaron's legal team had filed a counter motion demanding I retract my accusations, calling me mentally unstable and accusing me of parental negligence. It was a desperate tactic, but a dangerous one. If I didn't fight back, they could paint me as unfit, and he could try to claim custody. I broke down one night. Really broke down. My hands shook as I scrolled through old photos of my father holding my newborns, smiling proudly. This was not what he would have wanted. He had worked his entire life to build something meaningful for his family, and Alaron had turned it into a weapon. That night, I packed a go bag for the kids and stared at the front door until sunrise. If he could buy lawyers and fear, what chance did I have? I drafted a message to Io. I can't do this, and never hit send. At 6:12 a.m. I chose anyway. I woke the kids, made oatmeal, and kept going. Then a lifeline arrived. Danica, the journalist, called with a lead. A nonprofit legal group that specialized in financial crimes and intimidation cases. They agreed to review my evidence pro bono. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And now, with a new legal team, stronger evidence and public pressure mounting, Alaron was about to discover the one thing he'd underestimated: my endurance. The new legal team, Henderson and Ward, a nonprofit firm specializing in fraud and asset recovery, brought a level of precision and aggression that I hadn't dared hope for. They didn't just want to win the case. They wanted to obliterate Alaron's defense. But first, they needed more ammunition. "We have a solid foundation," Attorney Marla Ward explained during our first late-night strategy session. "But to fully dismantle his network, we need hard evidence, not just shell companies and leaked emails. We need a timeline, a money trail, and proof that he knew what he was doing was illegal." So, I started digging deeper than I ever had before. With AO's help, we combed through every file, every bank statement, and every digital trace. We found new layers of deception: accounts opened in Luxembourg, luxury condos purchased under false names, and a yacht registered to a company Alaron claimed didn't exist. It was an empire built entirely on stolen inheritance, but gathering the evidence wasn't enough. We also had to fund the legal fight, and I was nearly broke. My savings were gone, my old home was sold out from under me, and every cent went to childcare and survival. That's when the community I'd quietly built around me stepped in. Sabrina started a fundraiser on my behalf. Danica published a follow-up article that caught the attention of a victims advocacy group. Within weeks, donations and support flooded in, enough to keep the case moving forward. Meanwhile, the authorities had started to circle. The Financial Crimes Unit subpoenaed 2 of Alaron's shell companies, and the Island Bank, once untouchable, froze over $9 million of his stolen assets pending investigation. For the first time, he was running out of options. The man who thought he could intimidate me into silence was watching his empire crumble, brick by brick, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The first preliminary hearing arrived like a storm. My hands were shaking as I walked into the courthouse. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything that had led to that moment. Alaron was already there, sitting smugly beside his high-priced lawyers. He looked untouchable, as if this were just a minor inconvenience before he flew back to his villa abroad. But Marla had a plan, and it was far more devastating than Alaron realized. The judge began by reviewing the case summary. Estate misappropriation, fraudulent sale of inherited properties, forged signatures, and asset laundering. Alaron's lawyer argued that I had consented to the sales, presenting copies of documents bearing my signature. These show she was fully aware, the lawyer said confidently. Marla rose calmly, holding a stack of papers. Your Honor, she said, we'd like to submit evidence from a forensic handwriting expert. These signatures are not my clients. They're expertly forged, and here's the kicker. We found the digital drafts of those forged documents on Mr. Harrison's home computer. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Alaron's composure cracked for the first time, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting toward his lawyer. The judge leaned forward, visibly disturbed. Mr. Harrison, he said, if these allegations are proven, you're not just facing a civil case. You're looking at multiple felony charges. Then came the second blow. Marla introduced new evidence. Emails between Alaron and Cliff Marlowe discussing the forged paperwork before the sales occurred. It was undeniable proof of premeditated fraud. The judge froze all remaining estate-related accounts and ordered a full forensic audit. Alaron's legal team requested a delay, but it was too late. The tide had turned. For the first time, he wasn't in control, and he knew it. The courtroom ambush had shifted the momentum decisively. But Alaron wasn't finished. The very next evening, another unknown number lit up my phone. This time the voice wasn't distorted. It was low, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. Drop the charges, the man whispered. Or accidents happen. Schoolyards are dangerous. Cars skid. People vanish. Then the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was a promise. I immediately filed another police report, attaching the voicemail and citing the previous kidnapping attempt. But law enforcement moved slowly, and I knew Alaron was counting on that. Days later, the pressure escalated. Someone slashed the tires on the car Sabrina used to take my kids to school. A brick wrapped in a thin piece of paper. "You're next," was hurled through our rental's kitchen window. My legal team urged me to leave town for a while, but that would mean hiding again. And I was done hiding. Instead, I decided to use Alaron's own aggression against him. Marla contacted a private security firm, former detectives who specialized in corporate crime cases. They installed cameras around the house, escorted the kids to and from school, and tailed suspicious vehicles. Within a week, they had something. Cliff Marlowe himself meeting with two known enforcers, men with criminal records for intimidation and extortion. That footage was gold. It transformed Alaron's narrative from a civil family dispute into a case of organized criminal conduct. We submitted it to the district attorney, along with evidence of the kidnapping attempt, the vandalism, and the threats. The DA's office responded swiftly. A motion was filed to expand the charges against Alaron, now including witness intimidation, conspiracy, and attempted child abduction. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and suddenly, Alaron's world, once cushioned by stolen millions, was beginning to close in around him. By now, Alaron's arrogance had become desperation. Every move he made was reckless, a mistake we could exploit. The Financial Crimes Unit, spurred by the new criminal charges, dug deeper into the offshore accounts. Their findings confirmed what Io had suspected. He'd moved over $40 million across offshore vehicles, including roughly $12 million tied to Lisbon, shell companies, parking funds in high-end real estate, yachts, and private equity portfolios. And then came the break we'd been waiting for. An email leak from one of Cliff Marlowe's compromised accounts. It contained a booking confirmation for Alaron under a fake passport name. Destination, Lisbon. Date, 3 weeks from now. "This is our window," Marla said, her tone steely. "If we coordinate with Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, judicial police, we can freeze everything and arrest him the moment he steps on their soil. The plan was delicate. The DA's office filed an international assistance request under the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, MLAT, and Interpol was alerted. Simultaneously, AO coordinated with a contact inside the Portuguese financial regulator to flag any transaction linked to Aleron's aliases. If he tried to withdraw, transfer, or liquidate a single euro, the system would catch it. But as the net tightened, Aleron tried one final play. I received a cryptic email from a burner account. Meet me in Lisbon. No police, no lawyers. Come alone and you'll get half back. Refuse, and your children will pay. It was a trap. Of course it was. But this time I wasn't a scared mother hiding in basements. I was a woman armed with evidence, law enforcement, and the truth. We forwarded the email to Interpol, who launched an undercover operation around the meeting location. And when Aleron finally landed in Lisbon expecting control, he was greeted instead by armed agents and a warrant with his name on it. The hunter had become the hunted. And this time, there was no escape. The day Aleron landed in Lisbon was the day the world he'd built on lies began to collapse. He never made it to the meeting. Interpol agents, working with Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, judicial police, intercepted him the moment he stepped into the VIP terminal. The arrest was swift, public, and humiliating. News outlets across Europe were broadcasting footage of him in handcuffs before nightfall. But that was only the beginning. Prosecutors in our state asserted jurisdiction because the forged filings, property transfers, and threats had all originated here, and the primary victims, my children and me, lived within this jurisdiction. Portugal approved extradition on the state indictment. Our Attorney General's office coordinated the paperwork. Back home, the district attorney filed 27 counts including grand larceny, scheme to defraud, criminal possession of a forged instrument, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and attempted child abduction. Given her deep involvement in uncovering the fraud, the district attorney appointed Marla Ward as a special prosecutor on the case. An unusual move, but one that made sense. No one knew Aleron's web of deceit better than she did. The international cooperation had yielded mountains of evidence: transaction logs, internal communications, property deeds, even a voice recording of Aleron discussing how he'd forge my signature. And then, in a twist that shocked everyone, Cliff Marlowe flipped. Facing his own decades-long sentence, Cliff offered to testify in exchange for a reduced charge. His testimony painted Aleron as the mastermind, the one who orchestrated the offshore laundering, planned the threats, and even ordered the kidnapping attempt. With Cliff's cooperation, prosecutors expanded the case further, now targeting co-conspirators in 3 countries. The pressure was suffocating. Aleron's defense team filed for bail. It was denied. They petitioned for dismissal. The judge laughed them out of court. Even his allies in the investment world turned their backs, terrified of being implicated. But despite everything, I still didn't feel safe. Until the trial concluded, there was always a chance of a last-minute trick, a hidden asset, a paid-off official, a legal loophole. So I kept pushing. I kept documenting. I kept showing up to every hearing, every briefing, every interview. For the first time in years, the power was in my hands. And as Aleron sat in a foreign jail cell, stripped of his arrogance and empire, I finally allowed myself to believe the unthinkable. Justice was within reach. The trial date was set 6 months after Aleron's arrest, and those months felt like living inside a storm, but a storm that was finally blowing in my direction. Every week, another layer of his web unraveled. Hidden accounts were frozen. Offshore properties were seized. Former associates turned witnesses, each one more damning than the last. But nothing prepared me for the evidence IO uncovered just weeks before the trial: the smoking gun. Among terabytes of financial records subpoenaed from an encrypted server was a recorded call between Aleron and Cliff. On it, Aleron laid out everything: the plan to forge my signature, the fake trusts, the staged sales, even the threats. His voice was chillingly calm. She's a widow with kids, he said. She can't fight us. And if she tries, we'll scare her back into her hole. When I heard those words played in the DA's office, I cried. Not from sadness, but from a tidal wave of vindication. All those sleepless nights, all the hiding, all the fear, and here was proof, undeniable and unspinnable, that he knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecution added the recording to their evidence list, calling it premeditated criminal intent. It was the final nail in his coffin. The day before the trial, Alaron's lawyer made one last desperate plea, a settlement. He offered me $10 million in exchange for dropping the charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. I laughed, a bitter, cathartic laugh. You stole my children's future. You threatened their lives. You don't get to buy your way out of justice. And with that, I walked away. The next morning, as the courtroom doors opened and the media swarmed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: power. Alaron had taken almost everything from me. Now I was about to take everything from him, legally, publicly, and permanently. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation the morning Alaron's trial began. Reporters lined the steps, cameras clicked relentlessly, and I could feel the collective curiosity of strangers pressing in from all sides. But I wasn't here for them. I was here for my children, for my father's legacy, and for every sleepless night I had endured since the day my stepbrother stole everything from us. Alaron shuffled into the courtroom in a plain gray jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists. The man who once strutted through luxury auctions and private jet terminals now looked small, almost unrecognizable. But his eyes still burned with the same arrogance, the same belief that somehow he'd wriggle out of this, too. The prosecution opened with a quiet, devastating summary. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a family dispute. This is the story of a calculated, multi-million-dollar betrayal. A man who preyed on his own blood, left children homeless, and used fear as a weapon. I watched Alaron shift uneasily as the prosecutor laid out the timeline, the forged documents, the offshore laundering, the threats, and the kidnapping attempt. Piece by piece, the empire he'd built on deceit was stripped bare before 12 strangers. Then came the evidence. The forged signatures, the emails, the recordings, and finally, the phone call in which he admitted to planning my intimidation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even his own attorney's face paled, but it was the witness testimony that sealed his fate. Cliff Marlowe took the stand and, under oath, recounted every detail of their conspiracy. Elaine testified about the messages Alaron had sent bragging about cleaning house. Even Sabrina spoke about the van, the brick, and the terror we'd lived through. Each word was a nail in his coffin. And as the truth unfolded for all to hear, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about reclaiming the story he had tried to erase and rewriting it on my terms. The reckoning had begun, and this time there would be no escape. By the second week of the trial, the prosecution's case was airtight. Every thread Alaron had tried to bury was now woven into a damning tapestry. But his defense wasn't going down without a fight. They had one last tactic: discredit me. Their lead attorney, a sharp, cold man with an unnerving smile, approached the stand during my testimony. "Mrs. Harrison," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you have a history of financial instability? That you struggled with debt after your husband's death?" "Yes," I said firmly, refusing to look away. "Like many widows raising 3 children alone, I struggled. But that has nothing to do with my stepbrother forging my signature and stealing $50 million. He tried again. "Isn't it possible that you agreed to the asset liquidation, but later regretted it when the market shifted?" "No," I replied, "because I never agreed to anything. I discovered properties sold in my name while I was working part-time just to pay for groceries." The courtroom was silent. Even the jury watched intently as he threw every smear he could muster, painting me as emotional, bitter, financially naive. But the prosecution was ready. Marla stood and approached. "Mrs. Harrison," she asked gently, Why did you continue to pursue justice even when you were threatened, harassed, and nearly forced into hiding? I swallowed, steadying my voice. Because this was never just about money. It was about my children's future. It was about my father's name. And it was about proving that no one is above accountability. For the first time, I saw something crack in Alaron's expression. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the dawning realization that the story he had spent years controlling was now being told, and he was no longer the narrator. The tide had turned completely. And the jury knew it too. Day 12 of the trial brought a palpable shift in the room's energy. Until then, the jury had been mostly impassive, listening carefully, taking notes, betraying little emotion. But as the final witnesses took the stand, their faces began to change. Anger, disgust, even pity. None of it was for me. The prosecution's next witness was a former associate of Alaron's, a man named Rafael Santos, who had handled the paperwork for several of the offshore transactions. He'd agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, and what he revealed left the courtroom stunned. Mr. Harrison instructed us to move the funds quickly before the estate litigation could begin, Rafael said. He specifically mentioned forging documents if necessary, and even joked about how easy it was to manipulate a grieving widow. A murmur spread across the gallery. The jurors shifted in their seats. One woman covered her mouth, visibly horrified. Another scribbled furiously in her notebook. But the most devastating blow came when the prosecution played a snippet of the recording. Alaron's own voice, cold and calculating. She's a liability. All heart, no brains. Once the money's gone, she'll crawl away and disappear. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Even the judge's stern mask cracked into visible disdain. Alaron sat motionless, his face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. When I stepped down from the witness stand later that day, one of the jurors, a middle-aged father with kind eyes, looked at me and nodded, just once. It was subtle, but I felt its weight. They believed me. The man who had spent years calling me weak and powerless had underestimated one crucial thing. The truth has a power all its own. And in that courtroom, the truth was finally speaking louder than his lies. Alaron's empire wasn't just crumbling. It was turning to dust before everyone's eyes. By the third week of the trial, Alaron's defense had run out of tricks. The forged documents were discredited. The offshore accounts were traced. Witnesses from 3 countries had testified. Every story he'd spun was collapsing under the weight of hard evidence. And then, the defense made one last desperate gamble. They called Alaron to the stand. The courtroom went still as he shuffled forward, chains clinking faintly, and took his seat. He tried to project confidence, adjusting his tie, clearing his throat, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Mr. Harrison, his lawyer began smoothly. Can you explain, in your own words, what happened with your late father's estate? Alaron leaned toward the microphone. This has all been a misunderstanding, he said. I was trying to protect the estate. My sister was in no condition to manage $50 million. I made decisions to safeguard our family's legacy, decisions she couldn't. I clenched my fists. Even now, he was painting himself as the hero. And the offshore accounts? The prosecutor asked during cross-examination. Standard asset protection, Alaron replied with a shrug. It's common practice among high-net-worth families. And the threats? The kidnapping attempt? The forged signatures? His lips twitched. I have no knowledge of any of that. Then Marla stood, her voice like steel. Mr. Harrison, is this your voice on this recording? She pressed play. She's too weak to fight. If she talks, scare her? The room froze. Alaron's face drained of color. I was angry, he stammered. I didn't mean to steal $50 million. Didn't mean to forge legal documents. Didn't mean to threaten the lives of 3 children. His silence said everything. The turning point had arrived. The jury wasn't just skeptical, they were furious. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I could see it. The finish line. Justice wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The trial stretched into its fourth week, and with every passing day, the tension in the courtroom grew heavier. Closing arguments were set, the evidence was sealed, and the fate of my family's future rested in the hands of 12 strangers. Marla's closing statement was a masterclass in calm, relentless precision. "This isn't a family squabble over inheritance," she told the jury, pacing slowly before them. "This is a calculated, deliberate betrayal. A man who saw vulnerability, a widow with 3 young children, and decided to exploit it. He forged her name. He stole her legacy. He laundered millions. And when the truth threatened to catch up to him, he resorted to threats and violence." She paused, letting the silence settle. "Justice is not revenge. Justice is accountability. And today, accountability is in your hands." Alaron's lawyer tried a different approach, appealing to sentiment. He painted Alaron as a misguided son, overwhelmed by responsibility, claiming that poor decisions were not the same as criminal intent. But the jury's faces were stone. After weeks of evidence, no amount of eloquent spin could rewrite what they'd seen and heard. When the judge finally dismissed the court for deliberations, my heart pounded so loudly I could barely breathe. Hours passed. Then a day, then 2. Each night I stared at the ceiling, wondering if justice could slip away at the last moment, if all the suffering, the threats, the fear would be reduced to a mistrial or a technicality. On the morning of the 3rd day, the call finally came. The jury has reached a verdict. As I walked into the courtroom for the final time, I felt every heartbeat, every breath, every ounce of pain from the past 2 years converge into this single moment. Whatever happened next would define the rest of our lives, and deep down, I whispered a prayer. Let the truth be enough. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes the air itself feel heavy. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. My children sat with Sabrina in the 2nd row, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to know it mattered. When the judge asked the jury foreperson if they'd reached a verdict, my breath caught. "We have, Your Honor," the clerk read aloud, count by count. "On the charge of grand larceny, guilty. On the charge of forgery and falsification of documents, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty. On the charge of attempted child abduction, guilty." Today, silence lost. Every word felt like a brick lifting off my chest. By the time the final verdict was read, I was trembling. Alaron didn't flinch at first, but I saw the mask crack. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitened, and his eyes darted toward me, full of hatred, but also fear. For the first time, he was powerless. The judge turned to him, voice cold and unwavering. "Mr. Harrison, you have been found guilty on all counts. Your actions were not the result of poor judgment. They were calculated, malicious, and deeply destructive. You preyed on your own family and you endangered the lives of innocent children. You will face the full consequences of the law." The sentencing was set for 6 weeks later, but the damage was already done. Alaron was led out in handcuffs, the echo of the gavel sealing his fate. I closed my eyes, tears streaming silently. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was release. Years of fear, anger, and helplessness melted away into a quiet, trembling peace. For the first time in a long time, I believed it, we were safe. 6 weeks later, I found myself back in the same courtroom, but this time the tension felt different. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was gone. What remained was resolve and a deep, aching anticipation for closure. The courtroom was full again. Reporters, victims of other scams Alaron had run. Even distant relatives who once doubted me were now present, eager to witness the end. Alaron shuffled in wearing a plain orange jumpsuit. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, distant stare. The judge's words were measured and heavy. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "this court has found you guilty of a deliberate and calculated betrayal, one that destroyed trust endangered lives, and robbed a family of their legacy. The depth of your crimes is matched only by your lack of remorse. Then came the moment we had all been waiting for. It is the sentence of this court, the judge continued, that you serve 38 years in state prison, with no parole eligibility for 30 years. You are also ordered to pay $46 million in restitution to the victims, including your stepsister and her children. All seized properties and frozen accounts shall be liquidated toward that amount. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Alaron's attorney looked stunned. But the man himself just stared at the floor, his lips twitching in silent disbelief. His empire was gone. His freedom was gone. And his reputation, once carefully built on lies, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The judge paused before delivering one final blow. You chose greed over family, manipulation over decency, and now you will spend the remainder of your life answering for it. As he was led away in shackles, I didn't feel hatred, only a profound, quiet justice. The nightmare that had consumed our lives was finally over. For the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond survival, to imagine something gentler, something called living. The weeks that followed Alaron's sentencing felt strangely surreal. After years of constant fear, hiding from threats, battling in court, fighting just to keep my family safe, I suddenly found myself standing still. There were no more hearings to prepare for. No more sleepless nights wondering if justice would ever come. It already had. But freedom came with its own challenge: rebuilding. The restitution process began almost immediately. The court-appointed receivers sold Alaron's properties, liquidated offshore accounts, and funneled the funds back to the victims. It would take years to recover the full amount, but within months, enough was returned to stabilize our lives. I paid off debts that had haunted me since my husband's death. I bought a modest but safe home, one with a backyard big enough for the kids to run without fear. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was emotional. I enrolled in a business course at a local university, something I'd dreamed of doing for years but never had the time or resources for. I launched a small consulting business helping other families navigate inheritance disputes and fraud cases, using every painful lesson I had learned to protect others from the same fate. The kids were healing too. Their laughter returned, brighter and freer than it had been in years. Micah started drawing Mom as a superhero pictures at school. Jonah joined the debate team, telling his teacher, "My mom taught me to fight for what's right." And little Nova, once terrified to sleep alone, now insisted on leaving her door open, so the stars can watch me dream. Our lives weren't perfect. The scars remained, but they were proof of our survival, reminders of everything we had endured and overcome. And for the first time, the future felt wide open, not defined by what was stolen, but by what we were determined to build next. Months after the sentencing, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, a luxury I once thought I'd never have again. But the past had a way of finding its way back, even when justice had been served. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived in the mail with a federal seal. It was from Alaron. I almost threw it away, but something made me open it. The handwriting was shaky, the tone uncharacteristically subdued. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read. "I don't even expect you to read this. But sitting in this cell, I see everything I destroyed. Our father's legacy, your trust, my own future. I thought I was smarter, stronger, untouchable. Now I'm nothing. You were right to fight me. You were stronger than I ever imagined." I read the letter twice. A part of me wanted to tear it apart, to reject even the faintest hint of remorse. But another part, the part that had been hardened by pain and softened by healing, saw something else. Not redemption, not reconciliation, just a broken man finally facing what he'd done. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. That night, I sat on the porch as my children played in the yard. The stars were coming out, and the cool wind carried the smell of new beginnings. For the first time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't replaying the past. I was fully, completely present. The money we recovered would secure their futures. The business I built was thriving. And the story that had once defined us as victims now defined us as survivors. Justice had brought us peace, but resilience had given us purpose. And that, I realized, was the true victory. A year after the trial ended, life looked nothing like the shattered world I'd once known. The pain, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, they had all become chapters of a story that no longer defined us. Instead, they were stepping stones to something far greater. On the anniversary of my father's passing, I took the children to visit his grave. It was a bright spring afternoon, the kind he always loved, sunlight filtering through oak trees, the air carrying the scent of jasmine. I placed fresh lilies by his headstone and whispered softly, "We did it, Dad. We protected what you built." Micah read a letter he'd written himself. "Grandpa, I'll make you proud. I'm going to study law and help families like ours." Micah left a small toy tractor, "So you can keep building things in heaven." And Nova, in her sweet, determined voice, whispered, "We're safe now." Later that day, I stood in the office of my new nonprofit organization, the Harrison Foundation for Justice. What started as a support group for inheritance fraud victims had grown into a national network, offering legal resources, investigative support, and financial literacy programs to families who felt powerless, just like I once had. The walls were lined with photos of people we'd helped, survivors, fighters, rebuilders. As I looked around, a wave of gratitude washed over me. Alarin had stolen nearly everything once: money, security, peace, but he could never steal the resilience that had carried us here. I walked out into the late afternoon light, holding my children's hands. The road ahead was still uncertain. Life always is, but it was ours again. And it was brighter than I ever imagined. We were not defined by betrayal anymore. We were defined by what we built after it, a legacy of justice, strength, and unbreakable love. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.